Okay, so sorry about that. We got cut off there. So this is basically the area of Iraq today. And so this is the part of the world we're looking at. Let's look at all of these parts over here. The coastline is also interesting. This is known as the Levant. This is where Jewish or Hebrew people are from, and they're going to come up in a second here. So here we are. So let's switch PowerPoint over here. So this is another map of the same area. Again, basically the area of Iraq here, and Syria up here. But this area was in ancient times known as the Fertile Crescent. And looking at this map, maybe you can kind of see what we mean here. This is an area where there's a lot of fertility, a lot of good places to grow. We lost it. A lot of good places to grow grain, grow crops around these rivers, and sort of in the area of the coastline as well is also a part of where the fertile land is. It kind of makes a crescent shape. I think it's more of an angle bracket, but whatever works. So this is the part of the world that we're talking about, and in particular, we're going to start off looking at the cities over here near the coast. Okay, and again, as you can see, in this basically Syria and Iraq, Iran's over here. Okay, so when we look at the cities of Mesopotamia, where we're going to start off in terms of time is basically in the area that is known as Sumer or Sumeria, and these are the city-states that are Sumerian. And that is basically the name of the region down here, Sumer. And there are particularly a few cities that are really important, like Uruk and Ur and Lagash. But there were a lot of different cities here. There were, many hundreds. And so we've entered the time period of what are known as city-states. These are, a city that's also a state, kind of a weird understanding of what the word state means. But what it originally means is, a country, like a government. So each of these is a city that has its own government and is a complete separate kingdom all in one city. And that's basically the way things start out. The earliest form of government organization is to have everything be in one city-state. And so then the city-state can war with its neighbors, or take over other city-states and increase its power, or take over the farms or fields and things like that. It's almost like if Boulder and Denver were two different governments that would every so often go to war with each other or try to take each other over. Something like that might be the best way to imagine it. But they all have a lot of culture in common from a really ancient time. And the time we're talking about here when we see the first city-states is around 3,500. That's a rough estimate. Later on, we can pin things down a little more. But all of these city-states are basically independent at this point. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on here. For instance, in this time period is the invention of writing. This is cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems we know. And it's a writing system that involves making wedge-shaped marks on clay, and it's a Latin word meaning wedge-shaped, cuneiform. And why wedge-shaped marks? Because that's kind of the shape of the tool that you would use if you were digging into wet clay. And so this writing system is based off of these very sort of straightforward triangular marks with a kind of stylus that you dig into the clay still wet, and then you bake the clay, and then basically what you have is a letter, a message. And in fact, these messages, you would often have one inside of another one. You would like bake one, and then you would bake another one around it, and that was basically like having an envelope for your letter and a seal that you would break, to know if anyone was reading your letters. And so cuneiform seems to have evolved out of basically making marks to keep track of what kind of stuff you had. So like you would have, you'd have in your barnyard or something like that, you would say 3 sheep, and you would make like 3 little sheep heads. And eventually those sheep heads evolve, instead of drawings, into this writing system where you're representing the sounds of the language instead. using these little simple marks. So it all gets simplified and it turns into this. So that's a pretty cool achievement in human history, and it means that we can understand a lot about these cultures and learn what they valued and what they were concerned about and what was important to them. Another kind of artifact that we see a lot in Sumeria is the cylinder seal. And again, this is something that's going to last well through all sorts of different Mesopotamian time periods. The cylinder seal, the idea was that each different king would have a unique one. We look at them quite often for evidence of the mythology because they would have images from mythology. And this one is the warrior hero Marduk, defeating the great dragon or river monster Tiamat. And so, you'd show a scene from the mythology like that, and everybody would have, their unique sort of cylinder that images, and then they'd roll it over some clay, and that would be kind of their stamp, effectively, on the clay. To show that they were in charge and this was an official kingly document. So that's pretty cool. But we've been talking about kings. So what is the deal with kings in Mesopotamia? What can we learn about them? Well, like I said, they probably emerged as certain people tried to control more and more of the land and became known literally as the big men, the men who had more power. And eventually some of them become kings. And what kind of nature does their power have? Well, it's really interesting, actually. In ancient Sumeria, you have the priest kings as a very common way of being a king. So first thing about priest kings is that they always have a very similar sort of style of self-presentation. For instance, they usually depict themselves as having a beard that looks kind of weird to us. It's more of a chin beard, may have been a false beard at some points, or the beard that was just sort of styled in that way, braided or something like that. And a felt cap, turned up over the head. So it almost looks like a bowler hat in this one, but a rolled up felt cap and a beard is sort of the dress code for a Sumerian priest king. And he's got eyeliner to keep out the harsh Mesopotamian sun. And the way that these kings are presenting themselves is that their power comes from being in good with the gods. So that's, if you think about it, that's one way to really get people on your side, right? You say, I am the only one who can hear the messages that the gods have to say. And people say, oh, well, I guess you better be in charge then. That's kind of the idea of the priest king. And the priest kings were not gods. They were just people who were very good priests. They could guide worship of everybody else towards the gods. Now, statues like this were frequently left as offerings in Sumerian temples to the gods. So this is, a king making a portrait of himself, and then he gives it to the god, and basically the king's eyes are watching. The king will be watching the altar of the god and looking towards the gods basically forever, because he's got this statue to do it for him. And we see lots of examples of these types of statues. Some of them are really, really cool. This is a whole bunch of people. PowerPoint glitches. We got a whole bunch of people worshiping the gods in the temple. Kings and queens and important figures, leaders of the community and people in this hierarchy are looking towards the gods and worshiping them. This is known as a votive statue, kind of like the word devotion, meaning a gift to the gods. And the way that these priest kings depict themselves is sometimes with very big anime eyes to look into the direction of the god to really show that, they're looking, they're really beholding the god. It's a way of signaling how devoted they are. So, these guys took this stuff pretty seriously. And it's cool that we have these statues that we can see them. But what kind of temple do you have to the gods in ancient Sumeria? Well, quite frequently you have. This is the style of temple. Basically, you don't have too many building materials in the plain there. You have a lot of mud. You don't have a lot of minerals. You don't have a lot of wood. So how do they build their temples? Well, they build them out of mud. They take the mud and they bake it in the sun and they bake bricks out of it, and then they build a big brick temple. and it has usually a certain style of these staircases going up to the top of it. And Mesopotamia is so flat. If you build a mountain out there in the middle of this flat plain, it's going to stand out. It's going to be very noticeable. And so this is kind of, making your own mountain, showing off your power and showing off the power of the gods. And the gods are quite frequently associated with the mountains. There's this idea that you could go to the top of the mountain to communicate with the gods. Well, the king is bringing that mountain to you in the form of a ziggurat, and that's where he's going to go, and that's where people are going to go to worship the gods. And so he sets up temples like that. And the temples usually have a very specific style of layout. You enter from the side, and you have to turn 90 degrees to get to the altar of the god. That's a very common thing at the top of one of these ziggurats. And so, yeah, you'd come in through the side, and then you'd behold the statue of the god. And the god statue is supposed to have his very real presence there. Just as your worshiper statue is supposed to carry your presence eternally into the future. So you have the worshiper statues, and you have the god, and everybody is in the right hierarchy, the right relationship to the gods, which shows, the importance of having these sort of power relationships in this culture. One thing that you quite frequently see at this temple, at a temple like this, are lamassu. These are one of many sort of almost chimera-like mythological creatures that you see. They are sort of divine entities. They have power, and they are a symbol of the god's presence. And the most frequent form is the wings of a bull. The wings of an eagle, the body of a bull. Sometimes they also have lion parts as well, and they have the head of a king. But the way you can tell they're divine is that they have horns on their hat. That is a symbol of the gods traditionally in Mesopotamian culture. So this is a divine king and not just a priest king. This is sort of a more mythological entity there. And so you'll see those types of creatures cropping up all over the place. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the kinds of power. So we have this king sort of in this position of leadership over everybody else. And when we look at the artifacts from these early Sumerian cities, we see a lot of evidence of that. Take a look at this one. This is from a vase that was tragically destroyed by American soldiers, which really sucks. Was previously in a museum in Iraq. But look at sort of what the king is doing here. So again, you can recognize our king. He's got his hat, he's got his beard, he's got his eyeshadow, and he's making a gesture like this, which is the prayer gesture. He is sort of submitting himself to the gods like that. And he's got somebody behind him holding his sort of belt, scarf type thing. And so look at what he's doing and what's going on around him. He's got all these people who are kind of lined up, especially in the second rung here, and they seem to be bringing baskets of grain and fruit and stuff. And the king is sort of leading that procession. And where does it go to? It goes all the way to this figure over here who is receiving the gifts. And that seems to be the goddess Inanna, one of the most important and powerful of the Sumerian gods. She is receiving the gifts. So the king is leading everybody else towards her. So everybody's bringing the stuff to him, and he's bringing the stuff to her. That seems to be the basic idea. There's other stuff here like animals and more piles of food and drinks. This is probably a drinking vessel. This was probably a drinking vessel originally too. And then down at the bottom, you have the sort of food resources that make it all possible. You have the sheep and the goats, and you have the crops. And at the very bottom, you have the rivers being this foundation. Now, I should mention that the gods are a little bit scary in Mesopotamia because the rivers are a little bit scary. The rivers, they flood at random times. So you might get a flood that's really helpful to you and waters your crops, or you might get a flood that just completely wipes out your crops and ruins you. And that's kind of the Mesopotamian relationship to gods. So you really want to please these gods, and the king is the guy who's in charge of making sure everybody does that. That's the basic idea. Okay, we're running out of time in this video, so I will see you guys in the next video.